In the history of motor racing, there has never been a character quite like AJ Foyt. Born in the Lone Star State of Texas, AJ was around racing from the day he was born. His father, an auto mechanic, raced midget cars and built AJ toy racers that drive around their lawn. Foyt soon started racing the very car his dad ran, and at the age of 18 he raced for his father, running the USAC special event race held every year before the Indianapolis 500. His first win came in 1957, to which the next year he moved to the championship cars, the top level of open wheel in America. AJ's first start in the Indy 500 came in 1958, starting 12th and falling out with a quarter of the race left to go. He still managed 16th after a spin-out taking him out, and while the situation seemed intimidating for the Houston native, he knew what he wanted to do: win the Indianapolis 500. AJ returned in 1959 and finished the race in 10th. In 1960 he had a career year, winning his first title, but came home 25th in the big race. 1961 was different though. Foyt found himself close to victory, and coming to the final stops he was racing Eddie Sachs, who could make it all the way on gas. Foyt meanwhile was short on fuel, having to make an extra stop for the finish. AJ stayed ahead of Sachs, who pushed chasing him, unaware of the fuel situation that Foyt was in. This caused Eddie to shred his rear tire, and soon he had to come in to replace the tire, giving AJ ample time to also stop and take enough gas to go on to win the race. He became the first reigning series champion to win Indy 500 in history, and that accolade excelled him to another title, going back-to-back in 60 and 61, and officially into the record books. His 1962 bid ended with a lost wheel in the 500, and again fell out before halfway. In 1963 he finished third, losing out to Jimmy Clark and Parnelli Jones. In 1964, Foyt found himself in a dispute with the Ford Motor Company about who he could run for. They failed to meet AJ's demands, and he went back to the old reliable Offenhauser engine, and ultimately that ended up being the right choice for the Supertex. He dominated the race en route to his second Indy 500, elevating himself to another elite level at the Speedway. In 1965, Foyt won the pole for the 500, but fell out just past halfway with a rear end issue. 1966 saw Foyt go winless, and have his 500 chance ended early in possibly one of the biggest opening lap crashes ever seen in the race. 16 cars were involved, and the only driver hurt was AJ, but not in the crash itself. He was trying to get away from possible fires that might be caused from the incident, and jumped onto the outside catch fence. He began to scale the chain link fence, and hurt his hand in the process. 1967 had possibly one of the most clear-cut favorites in the history of the race. In a car built by Ken Walls, Parnelli Jones drove a turbo core, which in short summary is pretty much the jet engine strapped to an open wheel chassis. The car dominated the normal cylinder-powered cars and lapped the entire field. Coming into the final 10 miles, however, Parnelli's turbo car slowed and fell out of the race with mechanical issues. AJ, who was running second, assumed the lead and had just to make it home. But coming through the last corner, the final mile of the 500 sweepstakes, Carl Williams spun and engaged a 5-car crash in front of Foyt. Foyt slowed and weaved his car through the smoke and debris, driving home to his record-tying third Indy 500. By 1970, AJ had established himself as an icon of the Speedway, a generational talent, and a challenger for years to come on the AAUSAC circuit. Foyt now owned his own car, and was building his own racing empire. In 1972, he won NASCAR's biggest race, and made himself the second man to win both the Indy and Daytona 500. AJ over this time, however, seemed to have lost a step in Indy. Whilst the Master still was competitive, his only top 5 finish in the event since '67 was a 3rd place in 1971. And whilst AJ had won a few poles for the event, his goal of breaking the tie at 3 all-time wins, and doing it in his own car nonetheless, seemed to escape him every year. By 1977, AJ was dead set on breaking the record, and it probably was his best shot yet. Fresh asphalt coated the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in its entirety for the first time, allowing for sensational grip. Gordon Johncock took the speedway in early March for an unofficial tire test and set the official mark that boggled the mind: 200.401. For the first time ever, the 200-mile-an-hour barrier was positioned to be shattered. Another milestone was also up to be broken possibly. Janet Guthrie was announced to be attempting the race, and if qualified in, she would become the first woman the 500-mile sweepstakes has ever seen. The first grandson of a former competitor was also making an attempt: Teddy Paulette, grandson of former competitor Theodore Paulette. With all that, the circuit dived into the first week of practice. Foyt, Rutherford, and Andretti bounced around the 200-mile-an-hour barrier, and on May 4th, 1977, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway saw history, with over 200,000 spectators in attendance for qualifying. Foyt made the first charge at it shortly after 11 a.m., but fell 7 miles an hour short of the marker. Al Unser was next and got closer, but was still just over 4 markers off. 9 minutes before noon, and Tom Sneva roared his Cosworth engine onto the track. With the run he made, he put himself into history. 200.535 on lap 2. Over the 4-lap run, he averaged 198.884, giving Sneva the 1-lap record and the 4-lap track record, as tradition like in 1962 when Parnelli Jones broke the 150-mile-an-hour barrier. 200 silver dollars were dumped into Sneva's helmet. While the commemoration was granted to Sneva, Foyt was granted with dissatisfaction. Post-qualifying inspection discovered a fractured pop-off valve which DQ'd his qualifying run. Since the infraction was not an intended one by Foyt, USAC allowed Foyt to make another run at it. He went faster and got himself 4th on the grid. Bobby and Al joined Sneva on the front row, and Johnny Rutherford, another expected suspect to run 200, didn't even make a go of it on pole day, waving off and stalling both runs. On the second day, Rutherford made a run and spotted himself 17th. Clay Regazzoni wrecked on day 2 during his run, which sent his travel schedule into disarray. Regazzoni was attempting to run both the Indy 500 and Monaco Grand Prix, but now didn't know what to do. Regazzoni did not make it to third day qualifying, as the field eventually filled to 27 cars. Finally, on May 22nd, bump day, not only was Regazzoni on the clock, but Janet Guthrie was as well. She averaged 188.403 around the track, fast enough to officially become the first woman in Indy 500 history to start the race. In a show of respect, Bill Hedback poured 188 silver dollars into Janet Guthrie's helmet, to title Guthrie as the fastest woman in the Indy 500 history. Later that day, Clay Regazzoni finally qualified into the field. With about 2 hours to go, a bump battle between Salt Walther, Bubby Jones, Cliff Huckle, Eldon Rasmussen, Vern Chupin, John Mahler, and Joe Saldana persisted. With Chupin and Saldana being the odd men out, Rick Mears attempting the 500 also made a run in the last hour, but was slow and failed to make the race. And lastly, Jim Hurtubise made one last historic run in a Mallard Offie, which became the last official front-engine car to try and qualify for the event. During bump day, James McElrath Sr. and Jr. were also trying to make the event. As the first father-son duo, but Elrith Jr. failed to make the race, and sadly was killed in a sprint car crash later in 1977. On Thursday, Carb Day was not short of any controversy either. Salt Walther and his father George purchased Bill Puderbaugh's ride from Lee Elkins at a price of $60,000, equal to over $286,000 in today's value. Puderbaugh was then fired from his driving duties, and Salt Walther was placed in the driver's seat, set to move to the rear for driver changes. Quickly, public outcry overwhelmed the situation, and the Walthers had no choice. They decided to put Puderbaugh back in his place, and the ride kept its starting position after Friday. Race day at Indianapolis. The various traditions coat the atmosphere on the misty May morning, but one element is missing. The voice of IMS Radio Network, Sid Collins, was absent from the racetrack speakers, as Sid sadly committed suicide on May 2nd. It was 5 days after Sid had found out he was diagnosed with ALS, and with the tragedy, it would be the first time since 1951 a race would be without Collins. They needed a new voice of the 500, and the man to have the honor of his voice to aerate through the Indy airwaves would be no other than a young 32-year-old Paul Page. The humid air sets an extremely cruel atmosphere for the 61st running of the International Sweepstakes. They roll around the track and await the most anticipated moment in all of motorsports. And Tony Holman, like every year before, stands on the speedway he saved and gives the command for not 33 men, but 32 and one woman.
In company with the first lady ever to qualify at Indianapolis, gentlemen, start your engines.
Bomb signal to start as a clean first lap engages the 500-mile marathon.
They're now trying to get themselves into shape as they're coming down. You can see that. There's a fairly good lineup.
Starter Pat Sedan is going to give it to him. The great flag is out there racing. They're racing in Indianapolis. Going for the lead is Al Unser from the outside of the first row. And behind him, Tom Sneva and Bobby Unser. Mario Andretti is moving up into fourth place. And then AJ Foyt. Those sounds you hear are not explosions from the race cars. Everybody is all right. It's Al Unser and then Tom Sneva. Those are bombs that are set off yearly here as a signal that the race is underway.
Al Unser commands himself ahead of Sneva, who slots himself between the brothers. Johncock, through the opening 2 laps, charges all the way up to second, and Foyt moves to third. Through the opening laps, Al Unser commands over Johncock, and the reigning champion of the event falls out early. Danny Gaius comes in as well, investigating mechanical gremlins in his car. And Sheldon Kinzer has a smoking car, showing his early mechanical issues as well. Meanwhile, Janet Guthrie's in the pits as well, as they try to diagnose what's wrong with her car. Kinzer causes the biggest smoke show possible, choking many crew members and fans with the fumes. Pit stops soon commence, as the race continues without Janet Guthrie. Foyt has stayed out under stops and leads the race early on. Sneva nearly wipes out Foyt as he makes his first stop of the race, and Foyt through stops has held on to the lead and continues to hold it over Johncock. Gordon Johncock is now forgetting the heat, pressuring the veteran Foyt. And before the race between the two red machines can get more contested, 49-year-old Lloyd Ruby from Wichita Falls, Texas, has destroyed his car off of turn 2. Ruby is apparently trapped in the car after having the violent hit, and the 17-year veteran of the race is alert but is still stretchered off the course. By the time the race restarts, the leaders have passed the 100-mile mark, and Guthrie appears to now be officially out of the race. Mario Andretti also appears to have mechanical issues, taking him out of the event. But Johncock on the restart guns it, and gets Foyt by the start-finish line. The leaders continue the race, and traffic flocks the track in front of them. They try desperately to clear through the lap cars, and pole sitter Tom Sneva is currently one of the lap cars in front of Johncock, being trapped in pit lane as he misestimated the timing of the green flag. They race green past the quarter mark and prepare for more pit stops. Al Unser has issues during this run, as apparently furious, slamming the steering wheel. ABC won't show the supposed anger because of a workers' strike. They are incredibly low on technicians for the broadcast. Through the race, Johncock and Foyt stay together, and Sneva eventually unlaps himself and pushes to try and gain time on the two. As the race progresses, panic sets in for one of the leaders. Foyt rolls into the pits and slows. It appears he has run out of gas. They pit the car, and apparently they misestimated the fuel, and he had just run out of gas off of turn 4. AJ was able to somehow roll the car in, not vapor lock the engine, or damage it. Bobby Unser, meanwhile, is having what appears to be a fatal mechanical issue for the day. And as Bobby climbs out of the car, they ask him about the track conditions, to which he says they are the best he has ever seen them. The race is closing in, passing halfway, and at the 250-mile mark, Johncock has begun to build a safe hold on the lead. He holds only 2 other cars on the lead lap with him, AJ Foyt and Tom Sneva. But even they can't seem to keep up with Johncock. The pace car apparently lost a battery and is out of service for a short period of time, and Johncock with his enormous lead darts out of the groove in turn 1 and nearly totals his STP machine. He keeps it going, and now we cut to Chris Economaki, talking about fire-resistant underwear. The race keeps progressing as AJ pits once more, with Sneva as well. Eventually Johncock comes in and has a massive slip, holding the brake whilst the team is trying to push the car. Apparently Johncock is dying of thirst, and is becoming weary, having trouble focusing as the race nears its finish. AJ is now closing in on the weak Johncock, as he gets closer to possibly a 4th Indy 500 victory. AJ is now within 10 seconds of Johncock, closing in nearly 20 seconds. Gordon eventually comes in, and is getting doused with water, as he's being tortured by the heat. Gordon is done with his stops now, and AJ needs to make one more stop as well. Foyt needs to dig deep to gain those final 10 seconds, and on the stop, AJ is 2 seconds faster, but is still about 7 back. He also took 2 right side tires, which might provide enough grip to chase down Johncock.
Is moving toward what could be his second victory in the Indianapolis 500.
He's pulled across!
What happened?
Of smoke! Gordon Johncock, the leader of the Indy 500, is running down the side of pit lane now. Still on the racetrack, he's got a big drop.
We've seen this sort of thing so many times in Indianapolis. Just when it looked like it was all wrapped up, there he is off the track. It's all over for Gordon Johncock. AJ Foyt leads the Indianapolis 500.
Johncock suffered for nearly 3 hours just for the machine to fail the man. And with less than 20 to go, the race progresses on, and AJ holds his car steady at the front. Johncock, meanwhile, is so spent and hot, he jumps into the creek and douses himself in the cold water to cool himself after the marathon. AJ now has 2 laps to go, and with less than 5 miles ahead, he is about to set a benchmark men will chase for an eternity.
Foyt pit now is very pregnant indeed. Tony Foyt, AJ's father, with only 2 laps to go. That's not very far, that's 5 miles. And at those sort of speeds, that's not going to take too long. You know, for AJ, it must be a confusing thing going through his head now. He must know that 10 years ago he won his last one. He must be wondering, will the car just hold for please 2 more laps? 1.5 laps right now. Please, Lord, let it last. You feel little vibrations. You're frightened to even think about the possibility that you're going to win a race.
Only other slight possibility is that he might run out of fuel. Of course, he did early in the competition today, and they figured the fuel very, very close. Standing by for the white flag.
Well, I reckon he's pussyfooting that throttle pretty well, and there's the white flag by Pat Vidan being held out. I'll bet you anything he's driving with more economy than any Scotsman would economise with right now. I bet he's not giving it all he can give it right down that throttle of that great big turbocharged engine that he himself has put together. The man is a constructor, a designer. He seems to run the operation. He seems to be the mechanics. He seems to be everybody else right now. And look at Jim Gilmer and the rest of the team. They're even getting ready for it. And AJ's father on the left of the screen.
Coming down towards turn 3. It's the final lap of the Indianapolis 500. AJ Foyt is going to make motor racing history. The first man ever to win this great race 4 times. It started in 1911. This is the 61st race, and no one has ever achieved this before. Stand by for the checkered flag. The black and white checkered flag, and in the pits, the red and white checkered shirts of the Gilmore Foyt team. It's all over. AJ has done it. He has won his 4th Indianapolis 500.
You said a little something right after the race about not giving up, and something you had said to your own kids about that.
This is quite true. You know, I've had my children before, and they'll start a project and they'll want to give up. And like I said earlier, I said, this is what's wrong with the world today. So many people will start, you know, beautiful projects, and if things don't work out just right, they want to give up. And I've always said you can never be a winner when you want to be a quitter. And I think that's what made us as successful as we have been in racing or whatever we have tried, but we've never give up.
Of all the days in your life, where does this one rank?
This has to be the one.